Back in the days before dating apps were a thing, when meeting people online was still somewhat of a novelty, many of us gay men relied on sites like Manhunt and Dude's Nude to connect. It was a different world back then, and things felt both more personal and more dangerous. One particular night stands out in my memory, one that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It was late, sometime after midnight, and I had just come home from the local bars. Feeling restless, I logged on to one of the dating sites. Not long after, I found myself chatting with an unfamiliar local guy whose profile seemed promising. He lived nearby, and we exchanged pictures. Everything looked good. After some back and forth messaging, we agreed to meet up at his place. He told me he was hosting, meaning I would be going to his apartment. His building was just around the corner from mine, a place on Hollow Street between Emory and Crawford. I was excited, but also a little anxious, the way these things often go. He mentioned that his buzzer was broken, so I should knock and come straight in. When I arrived at his address, something felt off almost immediately. The apartment was peculiar for the city. It wasn't like most buildings with steps leading to a lobby or a vestibule. Instead, the door opened right onto the sidewalk, no barrier between the outside world and the apartment. It was as if the place had been carved out of the street itself. I knocked softly, but to my surprise, the door swung open from the lightest tap. The space beyond was bathed in darkness, save for a faint glow from a nearby street lamp filtering in through the windows. What struck me the most was the emptiness. The apartment was barren, no furniture, no signs of life, just a broom leaning against the wall and a plastic bag of trash sitting in the corner. "Hello?" I called, stepping hesitantly inside. My voice echoed in the empty room, swallowed by the darkness. I glanced toward the back of the apartment, where a door stood open, leading into a room shrouded in black. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello?" "I'm here." No answer, just silence. That's when the fear set in. The air in the apartment felt heavy, like something, or someone, was watching me. My skin prickled with unease, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. But I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. The silence was suffocating, and then I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of someone breathing. It wasn't my own breath. It was coming from the darkened room in the back. My heart pounded in my chest. Every fiber of my being wanted to run, but for a moment I couldn't move. The sound of that quiet, deliberate breathing seemed to creep closer, inching out from the shadows. That was enough to break my paralysis. Without another thought, I turned and bolted out of the apartment, not bothering to shut the door behind me. I sprinted down Hollow Street, my footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. I didn't stop running until I was halfway around the block, my lungs burning, my mind racing with fear. For some reason, I didn't feel safe going back to my own apartment just yet. I had this irrational sense that whoever had been in that room might be following me, watching me from the dark streets. I kept looking over my shoulder, trying to shake the feeling of being pursued. When I finally did make it back to my building, I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. My hands trembled as I sat down at my computer, ready to send him a furious message. But when I logged back into the site, his profile was gone. The chat history, the pictures we'd exchanged, everything had disappeared. It was as if he had never existed. For weeks afterward, I kept an eye out whenever I walked through the neighborhood. I never saw him again, never heard anything about that strange empty apartment. To this day, I don't know who or what was waiting for me in that darkened room. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. But the memory of that night still lingers, like a shadow in the back of my mind. Years ago, my friend Emily and I were invited to stay at another friend's holiday home in the south of France. The house, located in a remote village perched atop a hill, was an ancient stone building with an aura of mystery surrounding it. Our host, Sophie, believed that the land had been inhabited for over 1,000 years. The house itself seemed to breathe history. A cave on the ground floor served as a bathroom, and Sophie explained that it had once been used to store food in the days before refrigeration. Everything about the place felt steeped in the past. The house was tall and narrow, with one room per floor, connected by winding, creaky stairs. Despite its age, the house had a certain warmth to it, except for one room. As we climbed the stairs to our bedrooms on the top floor, We passed a door that led to the formal sitting room. Though the rest of the house felt inviting, something about that room sent a chill through me. The second we passed it, my body was flooded with an overwhelming urge to run. My blood went cold, and a voice in my head screamed, "Do not go in there." I couldn't see anything unusual in the room, but every instinct told me to stay far away from it. I didn't say anything to Emily or Sophie at the time. After all, Sophie was kind enough to let us stay in her beautiful home, and I didn't want to seem ungrateful or paranoid. But as we continued climbing the stairs, the eerie feeling lifted, replaced by the house's original charm. We spent the week exploring the French countryside, enjoying the sun-soaked terraces and picturesque views. But every time we returned to the house and passed that room, I quickened my pace and averted my gaze. I couldn't shake the unsettling energy that lingered there. It was as if something unseen was watching, waiting, just out of sight. On the last day of our stay, Emily and I packed our things and began the long drive back to the airport. I hadn't planned on bringing up the strange feeling I'd had about the sitting room, but as we wound our way through the hills, I casually mentioned it. "You know," I began, glancing at Emily from the corner of my eye, "there was something off about that sitting room in Sophie's house." Emily didn't respond at first. The atmosphere in the car shifted, and I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on us. I kept my eyes on the road, but sensed that she wasn't about to dismiss my concerns with a laugh, as I'd feared. After what felt like an eternity, Emily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw something," she said, "in the armchair." I felt a jolt of fear ripple through me. There was an old wingback chair in that room, positioned directly across from the doorway, in front of a large, crumbling fireplace. I hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but now, hearing Emily's words, my heart began to race. "What did you see?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Emily hesitated. She was silent for a long time, so long that I wondered if she would ever answer. "I don't think I can tell you," she finally said, her voice trembling. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to press her for details, to demand an explanation, but the fear in her voice made me stop. Whatever she had seen in that room, it was enough to haunt her, and somehow I knew I didn't really want to know. 20 years have passed since that eerie week in the south of France. I've lost touch with both Emily and Sophie, and though I've tried to forget that unsettling room, it lingers in my memory. Emily never told me what she saw in the armchair, and after a while I stopped asking. But every so often, when the wind howls or shadows dance just a little too eerily, I find myself thinking of that house in Montfleur. What presence haunted that sitting room? What did Emily see? And why, after all these years, does the memory of that place still send chills down my spine? Some things, perhaps, are better left unseen. It was the summer of 2020, a year when everything seemed to go awry. My husband Daniel and I had planned an extravagant vacation to Europe, but with the pandemic surging, our plans dissolved like so many others. On a whim, we decided to embark on a road trip to a small town called Crescent Hollow in southern Vermont. This place held special memories for us. We'd lived there for years while Daniel pursued his doctorate at a local university. The area was known for its charming eateries, scenic hiking trails, and at the time, a relatively low number of COVID cases. It was a 4-hour drive from our apartment, offering the perfect escape from our cramped one-bedroom. That weekend was nothing short of blissful. We caught up with old friends in socially distanced settings, indulged in delicious meals from our favorite restaurants, and hiked through lush trails. It was the break we needed. Reluctant to head back, we delayed our departure until late Sunday evening. We set off into the pitch-black summer night, leaving behind the glowing lights of Crescent Hollow. I had made this drive more times than I could count, especially when Daniel and I were long distance during his first year of grad school. I often found myself driving through the dead of night, the vast and winding state highway stretching out in front of me, flanked by thick forests. Though the road had always felt somewhat eerie, I had never experienced anything truly disturbing. That night, however, something felt different. After an hour on the road, Daniel took over driving. I sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through music and occasionally staring out into the endless expanse of fir trees. We were the only car on the highway, a fact that made me oddly anxious. Our conversation had just drifted into a peaceful silence when I spotted something on the roadside. "Did you see that?" I asked, sitting up a little straighter. Daniel nodded, his eyes glued to the road. It was a deer, or what was left of it. The animal's body lay unnervingly close to the center divider, far from the forest. But it wasn't the typical sight of roadkill that bothered me. It was the positioning. The carcass looked staged. Its limbs were splayed out unnaturally, like someone had placed it there with care, making sure it was on full display. "That's unsettling," Daniel said after a long pause, his voice tight. A few minutes later, we passed another animal. This time, it was a deer again, similarly positioned along the divider, like a grotesque piece of art. A feeling of dread settled over me. What kind of driver hits two deer in such a short span and leaves them like that? "That's two now," I muttered, staring out the window at the darkened landscape, my heart beginning to race. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Daniel offered, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened. 10 minutes passed, and we saw it again. This time, it wasn't a deer, but a coyote. Its bloodied body displayed the same way as the others. By now, my stomach was churning with fear. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel whispered, his earlier calm fading. I couldn't help but blurt out, "It's like these are markers. Something or someone is leaving a trail." The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and the weight of them hung in the air between us. Daniel gave me a horrified glance, his foot pressing harder on the gas as if to outrun whatever was happening on that road. The silence between us was heavy, interrupted only by the low hum of the engine. Minutes later, we passed yet another gruesome display, this time a bobcat, its limp body laid out almost artistically. The road was empty except for us, and it felt like we were being watched by unseen eyes hiding in the dark forests that lined the highway. "Okay, this is insane," Daniel finally admitted, his voice shaky. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his unease palpable. "What do you think this is leading to?" I didn't respond, but my heart pounded with the same question. We drove on in suffocating silence, both of us on edge, hoping for any sign of civilization, any way off this haunted stretch of road. With every mile, my anxiety grew. I kept my eyes locked on the shadows, convinced that something might leap out at us, or worse, that we were driving towards something we couldn't escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the green signs of the toll road loomed ahead. Relief washed over me as we entered the brightly lit toll plaza. Daniel slowed down to register our Easy Pass, but the second it cleared, he floored it. For the rest of the drive home, we didn't encounter a single dead animal. The relief of being on a populated road was like shedding a heavy cloak of fear. As the immediate sense of danger faded, we laughed nervously about how strange it had all been. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. We had stumbled across something sinister on that desolate stretch of highway, something that still makes me shiver to think about. Whatever was happening along that road in southern Vermont, I'm just thankful we got away. We never spoke of it again after that night, but I can't help but wonder what was waiting for us if we hadn't gotten off in time. During my first year at Alton University, I lived in a co-ed dorm. The building was divided into parallel halls, with boys on one side and girls on the other, separated by a row of elevators in the middle. Everyone on my floor had heard the same story, a rumor that the elevators were haunted by a student who had died tragically in his room some 15 years earlier. The details were vague, but the story went that he had left behind a note, lamenting how no one, especially girls, ever talked to him. It was the kind of urban legend that gets whispered during late-night hangouts. I shrugged it off and didn't think much more about it. Later in the semester, I found myself struggling in an advanced economics class. There was a quiet guy named Dan who sat next to me, always ready with the right answer when the professor called on him. Dan wasn't much of a talker, but one day after class, he approached me, mentioning that he had seen me around our floor and offering to help me study. Since I desperately needed the help, I agreed, and we made plans to meet at the library. Dan turned out to be an incredible tutor. In just a couple of hours, he managed to explain complex concepts better than our professor ever could. I was beyond grateful, and I told him I owed him for all his help. That's when his shyness seemed to melt away, and out of nowhere, he asked me out. I wasn't exactly attracted to him, But he was kind, and I admired his intelligence, so I said yes. We made plans to go out that Friday. On Friday evening, as I was getting ready, Dan messaged me and asked if I could meet him in his room instead of going out as we had planned. He said his room was right by the elevators, and he had set up pizza and beers, along with a movie. Our original plan had been to get Chinese food at a nearby restaurant, but I didn't mind a quiet night in, so I agreed. When I arrived at his room, something felt off almost immediately. The space was bare, with nothing personal on the walls or desk, and it gave off this strange, unsettling vibe. There were 2 beds, but one of them was stripped down to the mattress. When I asked about his roommate, Dan casually mentioned that he had moved out because the room creeped him out. He then added, almost as an afterthought, that this was the room where that student had died years ago. I felt a chill run down my spine, but before I could react, Dan started talking about the guy who had died, how he had done all this research on him. He told me the guy had issues with women, a history of stalking, and drug problems. But what stuck with me the most was when Dan said the student had loved horror movies and even had an old webpage listing all his favorites. Apparently, Dan had made it his mission to watch all of them, and that night, he had picked one for us to watch together. By this point, the strange atmosphere in the room and Dan's fixation on the dead student were making me incredibly uncomfortable. I told him I wasn't a fan of horror movies and asked if we could watch something else instead. "Shh," Dan whispered suddenly, glancing around the room. "He's listening." I froze, not sure what to say. Dan turned the movie on anyway and draped his arm around me. That was it. I couldn't stay another minute. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave. As I was reaching for the door handle, Dan looked at me and said in a soft, almost eerie voice, "Okay, but remember, you owe me." Over the next few weeks, that phrase became a sort of mantra for him. You owe me. He texted it after I aced my economics exam. He wrote it on my roommate's dry erase board when we accidentally left our door unlocked. He even scrawled it on the fogged-up mirror in the bathroom while I was in the shower. The whole thing was unnerving. Dan's obsession with the dead student and the haunted room had clearly affected him. I went to the resident advisors, RAs, and told them everything. They spoke to Dan, instructing him to stay out of the girls' bathroom and leave me alone. For a while it worked, except now he started leaving his dorm door wide open every time I passed the elevators. His eyes would follow me as I hurried by, and I always kept my back turned to that room, afraid of what I might see if I looked inside. And then one day, Dan was gone. His door was open, but the room was empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing but the bare, stripped-down bed. The doorknob was missing too. Even though I had been terrified of him for weeks, I felt a strange sense of sadness. Dan had started out as a kind, helpful classmate, someone I thought I could trust. But the deeper I dug into the story, the more I realized just how dark things had gotten for him. Later that year, some of the guys on his side of the hallway opened up to me. They told me how Dan had gone from being quiet and shy to deeply obsessed with the ghost in his room. He claimed the dead student spoke to him at night, and his roommate had left because he no longer felt safe. They said campus security had found knives hidden under Dan's bed, along with other weapons. Months later, my RAs revealed the full story to me. The university had expelled Dan after he was caught hiding in a stall in the women's bathroom with a knife. One of the RAs made a tasteless joke about him needing a sacrifice, but I didn't laugh. They told me I should call the police if I ever saw him again, and nobody ever moved into that room. The door stayed open, becoming a kind of dorm legend. People claimed to see shadows moving inside late at night or hear whispers near the elevators. I never looked back. I never dared. Years passed, and by the time I was in graduate school, I had moved on, mostly. I was engaged to be married when one evening, my fiancé and I both received a friend request from someone we didn't recognize. There was no profile picture, just a name that neither of us knew, but the person had gone to Alton University. Curious, I did a quick search for the name. It led me to old articles about the suicide in my dorm from the 90s. Someone was using that student's name. That night, I received a message request. It was simple, but it sent shivers down my spine. It read, "You owe me." In the early 1980s, when I was a teenager, I attended a sleepaway summer camp in the remote wilderness of northern Vermont. Nestled deep in the Green Mountains, the camp was set on the shores of a tranquil, mist-covered lake, far removed from civilization. It took about 20 minutes by car to reach the nearest town, and once you crossed through the camp's entrance, you were completely disconnected. This was long before cell phones or the internet existed, so the camp truly was its own isolated world. For 8 weeks each summer, we were surrounded by nature, with no distractions from the outside world. It was a magical place for a kid. During the day, the camp buzzed with activity, swimming, hiking, boating, and crafting. But by night, the dark blanket of the forest closed in around us, and the lake transformed into an ominous black expanse. It was beautiful, sure, but also a bit eerie, as if something was always lurking just beneath the surface. Every summer, on the last night of camp, we gathered for a huge bonfire on the beach. The atmosphere was always bittersweet. People said tearful goodbyes, exchanged addresses, for snail mail, of course, and shared last moments with their summer crushes. The fire roared, lighting up our faces, and the crackle of wood mixed with the sounds of music blaring from boomboxes. Beyond the firelight, however, was a different world. Looking out over the lake at night, you couldn't see a thing. It was just a void of blackness stretching endlessly toward the forested hills on the far side. It was around 9 p.m. when it happened. We were all gathered, singing songs and goofing off, when suddenly a voice pierced the night. "Please, somebody help me," a man's voice screamed, clear and desperate. The sound came from the direction of the lake, and immediately, everything stopped. Every camper and counselor fell silent, eyes wide as they stared out toward the water. The fire crackled softly in the background, and in that moment, it seemed like the entire camp held its breath. One of the counselors pulled out a flashlight, shining it across the water's surface. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing. No boat, no swimmer, no ripple in the water. Just emptiness. Some of us nervously laughed, hoping it was some sort of elaborate prank, but something about the cry for help didn't feel right. We all heard it, and it was raw, filled with genuine panic. A few minutes passed, and everyone began to relax, talking quietly again and trying to shake off the fear. But then the voice came again, louder and closer this time. "Please, somebody help me," the man shouted, more frantic than before. Flashlights immediately swept the lake again, but still there was nothing. One of the head counselors, a tall, no-nonsense guy named Dave, stepped forward and shouted, "Where are you? We can't see you. Tell us what you need." His voice echoed across the water, but there was no answer. The tension was thick in the air. Dave turned back to us, his face pale in the flickering light. He didn't shout this time, but his voice was firm. "Everyone, back to your cabins. Now." We didn't argue. In seconds, the mood had shifted from fun and games to something much more serious. My friends and I scrambled up the hill toward the cabins, and you could feel the unease radiating off everyone. That night, instead of the usual pranks or pillow fights, we whispered late into the night about what had happened. Some thought it was a prank, others were convinced someone was drowning, but no one could explain why we hadn't seen anything on the lake. That night, counselors took shifts watching over each cabin. They sat outside with flashlights, scanning the woods and the water. Inside, we lay awake, listening for any more sounds, but the voice didn't return. The next morning, instead of the usual routine of cleaning up the camp and preparing for departure, we were woken up early by the sound of the camp bell. When our counselor came in, he had a strange, hurried look on his face. "Buses will be here in 20 minutes. Pack your stuff. We're leaving." We were stunned. Normally, the last day of camp was relaxed, filled with final goodbyes and wrapping things up. But now we were being rushed out without any explanation. We packed quickly, still rattled by the events of the previous night. The buses arrived earlier than scheduled, and just like that, we were heading home. Over the years, I've tried to find out what really happened that night. As the internet grew, I scoured articles, local archives, and camp forums looking for any sign of an accident or incident that might explain the mysterious voice on the lake. But I never found anything. There were no reports of drownings, no missing persons cases from that area, no clues at all. Strangely enough, the camp is still running to this day. I even joined an alumni Facebook group, and every once in a while, someone will bring up that final night in 1982. The posts are always cryptic, with people commenting things like, "I was there," or "I'll never forget it," but no one ever dives deep into what happened. It's like we all silently agreed to remember, but never to relive it. 4 decades later, the memory of that voice still sends a chill down my spine. Who or what was out there that night? We may never know, but for everyone who was there, it remains one of the most unsettling experiences of our lives. When I was in 4th grade, my mom and I moved to a small town a few hours away to live with my grandmother. I was an only child and painfully shy. At my old school, all my friends had known me forever, but in this new place, I had no idea how to connect with anyone. One day during recess, a girl named Lizzie approached me. She was confident and friendly, instantly making me feel at ease. From that day on, Lizzie became my best friend. We walked home from school together and hung out at my grandma's house until it was time for her to head home. My mom worked long hours, so my grandma was the one keeping an eye on us. But lately, Grandma had started acting strangely. Sometimes she'd call me by my mom's name. Other times, she'd accuse me of stealing things, even though I hadn't. To avoid her odd behavior, Lizzie and I spent most of our afternoons in the backyard. Sometimes I'd glance back at the house and catch Grandma watching us from the window, cigarette in hand, glaring. Lizzie told me stories about camping trips her family took in the nearby woods, something I had never experienced. I was fascinated. We spent hours pretending to hike, pitch tents, and fish in imaginary streams. In our little world, we were explorers, camping out in the wild. We even built a giant pile of sticks and leaves, pretending it was our campfire. One afternoon, as we passed through the living room on our way outside, Lizzie quietly grabbed my grandma's lighter from the table. She motioned for me to stay quiet, and for some reason, I didn't think to question her. In the backyard, Lizzie crouched by the pile of dry branches and flicked the lighter on. At first, the fire seemed small and harmless, barely catching on the twigs, but in an instant, it roared to life. Before I could process what was happening, the fire leaped from the pile and caught the side of the house. Lizzie dropped the lighter and ran. I just stood there, frozen in shock as flames engulfed the wall of the house. The next thing I remember is my grandma screaming and the wail of sirens. The fire department arrived quickly, and the house wasn't completely destroyed, but the damage was done. My mom was furious. Not long after, she decided I should move back with my dad, returning me to my old school. I was too ashamed to tell my friends what had happened, and no one ever asked me about Lizzie or the fire. Soon after I left, my grandma was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She grew worse over time, and my mom spent all her days taking care of her. I only saw Grandma once more before she passed away, but by then, she didn't know who I was. Years later, during a casual conversation, my mom mentioned how worried she had been about me not making friends when I was younger. I felt hurt by the comment. I did have a friend, I reminded her. Her name was Lizzie. Lizzie, my mom asked, confused. Who's Lizzie? I realized then that my mom had never actually met Lizzie. She wasn't in my class, but we spent every lunch and recess together, and she came to my house almost every day. I was sure Grandma must have mentioned her or at least seen her through the window, but my mom insisted she'd never heard of Lizzie. In fact, at a parent-teacher conference, she was told I was always alone at school. I tried to think of some proof of Lizzie's existence, a photo, a note, anything, but there wasn't any. I remembered Lizzie always leaving in the same direction after our play dates, heading down the street toward what I thought was her house. But when I told my mom this, she shook her head. There aren't any houses down that way. That's just an industrial park. To this day, I don't know what to make of it. Lizzie felt so real. But now, looking back, I wonder if she ever really existed at all. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.